There are moments in the NFL draft cycle that stop the entire football world cold. Moments where something is said or left unsaid that sends shockwaves through every locker room, every front office, every sports bar in America. And what just happened with Todd Monken and Shedeur Sanders is one of those moments. This isn't just a quarterback evaluation. This isn't just pre-draft noise. What's unfolding right now could permanently alter the trajectory of one of the most hyped, most polarizing, most talked about quarterback prospects in the history of college football. And the scariest part? Nobody saw this coming. Not like this. If you follow NFL draft coverage, if you care about the future of the game, if you've been watching Shedeur Sanders build his legacy from Jackson State all the way through Colorado, you need to stop everything and watch this video until the very end. Because what Todd Monken just did, what he said, what he implied, and what the silence around it all means, it changes everything. Hit that subscribe button right now, because this channel covers the stories the mainstream media glosses over, the real narratives, the ones that actually matter. Now let's get into it. To truly understand the magnitude of what's happening here, you have to go back. You have to understand who Shedeur Sanders is, where he came from, what he represents, and why his NFL draft story has become one of the most emotionally charged, most fiercely debated storylines in recent football history. Shedeur Sanders is not just a quarterback prospect. He is a symbol. He is the son of Deion Sanders, prime time himself, one of the greatest athletes this country has ever produced, a Hall of Fame cornerback, a two-sport superstar, a man whose charisma and confidence were so overwhelming that he literally transformed the culture of every program he ever touched. And Deion didn't just pass down genetics to his son. He passed down that unshakable belief, that swagger, that refusal to be ordinary. Shedeur Sanders grew up in the orbit of greatness, and from the very beginning, the football world was watching. His journey started at Jackson State, where his father took over as head coach and immediately turned a historically black university program into a national sensation. Shedeur didn't just play well there, he dominated. He threw for over 6,000 yards across 2 seasons, posted completion percentages that would make NFL coordinators salivate, and did it all with a poise and a command that looked years beyond his age. People started paying attention, real attention. But the skeptics were already sharpening their knives because Jackson State was not playing Power 5 competition, and in the eyes of many NFL evaluators, that qualifier always hangs over a prospect like a shadow. Then came Colorado, the transfer that shook college football. Deion Sanders took the head coaching job at the University of Colorado Boulder, and Shedeur followed. And in their first season together, they pulled off something that bordered on miraculous. Colorado started the 2023 season 2-0. Shedeur was playing like an absolute star. The country was watching every single game, and the Travis Hunter story was becoming intertwined with the Sanders saga in ways that made it impossible to look away. Deion was on every major network. Shedeur was being discussed as a legitimate first-round talent. Colorado was the most talked-about team in college football, full stop. Yes, the season eventually unraveled. The losses piled up as Power 5 defenses caught up to the scheme, and Colorado's roster depth was exposed. But Shedeur Sanders personally had done enough to keep his NFL stock rising. He took an almost incomprehensible number of sacks, absorbing punishment behind an offensive line that was, by any objective measure, one of the worst in major college football, and still delivered, still completed passes at an elite rate, still showed the intangibles that scouts look for in franchise quarterbacks. His 2024 season was even more impressive statistically, and by the time the college football playoff conversation was happening nationally, Shedeur Sanders was firmly in the conversation for the top 5 picks in the 2025 NFL Draft. The Cleveland Browns held the first overall pick, and that's where this story starts to get complicated. The Browns had been a franchise in crisis for years. Their quarterback situation had been a revolving door of disappointment, hope, and catastrophe. Deshaun Watson's contract had become an albatross around the organization's neck, a guaranteed deal worth over $200 million, tied to a player whose performance had declined dramatically and whose legal controversies had made him one of the most polarizing figures in sports. The Browns needed a reset. They needed a face. They needed a signal caller who could walk into First Energy Stadium, or whatever its corporate name is by the time you're watching this, and give that long-suffering fan base something to believe in again. Shedeur Sanders, in the eyes of many NFL draft analysts, was that guy. He was projected by multiple respected mock drafts to go #1 overall. His name was synonymous with the Browns' pick for months. This felt inevitable. This felt written. Then the cracks started appearing.
The pre-draft process is a brutal, dehumanizing exercise that NFL teams justify under the banner of due diligence. Prospects are poked, prodded, psychologically evaluated, questioned about their personal lives, tested on football IQ, put through workouts in front of scouts with stopwatches and clipboards, and perhaps most importantly, interviewed at length by the coaching staffs of teams that might select them. These interviews are closed-door, off the record, and almost never reported accurately in real time. But sometimes something leaks. Sometimes a coach says something publicly that reveals more than he intended, and sometimes a team's behavior during this process tells you everything you need to know without a single word being spoken. What the Cleveland Browns did and what Todd Monken said falls into both categories simultaneously. Todd Monken is the offensive coordinator of the Cleveland Browns. He's a highly respected mind in offensive football, a man who's worked at the highest levels of college and professional football, and someone whose opinion on quarterback evaluation carries genuine weight. When Monken speaks about quarterbacks, people in this league listen. So when he held his pre-draft press availability and the conversation turned to Shedeur Sanders, everyone leaned in. Everyone expected either a strong endorsement or a carefully worded diplomatic non-answer. What they got was neither. Monken's comments about Shedeur Sanders were measured in a way that felt deliberate. He acknowledged Sanders' talent. He acknowledged the college production. But the enthusiasm, the kind of enthusiasm you'd expect from an offensive coordinator talking about a player his team might select first overall, was conspicuously absent. There was a flatness to it, a clinical detachment that, to anyone who has covered the NFL long enough, screamed volumes. In NFL draft culture, when a team's offensive coordinator talks about a prospect they're genuinely excited about, you can feel it. The words carry energy. There's a passion underneath the carefully managed media language. With Monken talking about Shedeur Sanders, that energy was missing, and the football world noticed immediately. But that was just the beginning of the strangeness surrounding the Browns and Shedeur. Reports began emerging, first from the fringes of the NFL draft media universe, then from more established and credible sources, that the Browns' pre-draft process with Shedeur Sanders had not gone the way anyone expected. The formal interview, which teams are permitted to conduct with prospects during the pre-draft period, was reportedly cut short, not by hours, but significantly shorter than standard. There were whispers that the interaction between the Browns staff and Shedeur's camp had been strained. There were suggestions that the dynamic in that room had been something less than warm. Specific details were murky, as they always are when they're coming through layers of NFL sources who have their own agendas and their own reasons for shaping narratives. But the general picture that was being painted was clear. Something had gone wrong between the Cleveland Browns and Shedeur Sanders during the pre-draft process. Now here's where the story becomes genuinely fascinating, because you have to understand the context surrounding Shedeur's pre-draft profile beyond just the Browns. Multiple teams conducted interviews with Shedeur during the pre-draft window, and while most of those interactions were reported as positive, or at least neutral, there were other troubling signals elsewhere. There were reports, and these reports gained significant traction in legitimate NFL media circles, that Shedeur's interview performances were inconsistent, that in some rooms he came in with a confidence that bordered on what evaluators described as a lack of coachability, that the humility and hunger that teams want to see from a young quarterback entering a new professional environment wasn't always present. Now, to be absolutely clear, these are characterizations that come from anonymous sources, from teams that might have their own motivations for shaping Shedeur's draft stock downward, and from a sports media ecosystem that historically, and let's be honest about this, treated black quarterbacks with a particular scrutiny and skepticism that their white counterparts have often not faced. The subjectivity involved in these evaluations is real and significant.
But here's the cruel reality of the NFL draft. It doesn't matter if the criticism is fair. It doesn't matter if the evaluation is tainted by bias. What matters is the perception within the league, because perception is what drives draft boards, and draft boards determine futures. And the perception, as of the final weeks before the draft, had shifted meaningfully. Where once Shedeur Sanders seemed like a lock for the first overall pick, there was now genuine uncertainty about where he would land. Teams that had been expected to be competitors for his services were suddenly showing interest in other quarterbacks. Cam Ward, the Miami quarterback who had transferred from Washington State and put together a stunning final college season, was now in serious contention for that #1 spot. Cam Ward had his own incredible story, his own compelling talent, and his own passionate advocates in NFL front offices. And as the Shedeur narrative grew more complicated, the Ward narrative grew louder. The Cleveland Browns, who had seemed so certain to take Shedeur, were now reportedly doing due diligence on multiple quarterbacks. Some draft insiders began speculating that the Browns might not take a quarterback at all with the first pick, that they might trade down or select a non-quarterback prospect, or make any number of moves that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. The uncertainty was total, the noise was deafening, and Shedeur Sanders was caught in the middle of all of it. Let's talk about what was really being debated here, because this matters. The football evaluation of Shedeur Sanders is one that, if you strip away all the noise, is genuinely complex. His supporters, and there are many, including respected analysts, point to numbers that are simply hard to argue with. His completion percentage across his college career was elite. His ability to process defenses quickly, to go through his reads, to understand coverage rotations and find the open man, these are skills that translate to the NFL, and Shedeur demonstrated them repeatedly and consistently. He was accurate under pressure, accurate on deep balls, accurate on timing routes. He showed the ability to manipulate defenses with his eyes. He showed patience in the pocket when the protection was clean. These are genuine, bankable qualities. His detractors point to a different set of concerns. The level of competition, while improved significantly in the Colorado era compared to Jackson State, was still not consistently elite. His mobility, while not a weakness per se, is not the dynamic scrambling threat that modern NFL defenses have to account for. His physical tools, arm strength, size, athleticism, are solid but not transcendent. And then there's the question that nobody in the mainstream media wanted to ask directly, but that everyone in NFL front offices was apparently asking behind closed doors. How does Shedeur Sanders respond to adversity? How does he handle being coached hard? How does he take correction? Because at the NFL level, every quarterback, every single one gets humbled. The game finds your weaknesses. Your coaches identify them and push on them hard. And the quarterbacks who thrive are the ones who embrace that process rather than resist it.
The questions being whispered about Shedeur were not questions about his football IQ. They were questions about his mentality in a professional environment. And those questions, fair or unfair, were doing real damage to his draft positioning in real time. The Deion Sanders factor deserves its own chapter here, because you cannot tell this story completely without addressing it. Deion Sanders is one of the most magnetic, charismatic, and forceful personalities in the history of American sports. He has never been someone who fades into the background. He has never been someone who lets his son's story be told without being a central character in it. And throughout the pre-draft process, Deion was visible. He was talking. He was advocating. He was making clear that he believed his son deserved to be treated as the top prospect in this draft. And his presence in the conversation, while entirely understandable from a father's perspective, was something that some NFL evaluators found complicated. There were reports that the degree to which Deion was involved in the pre-draft process gave some teams pause, that front offices, for whatever reason, were factoring in the Deion dynamic when making their evaluations. Whether that's fair, whether that reflects genuine football concerns, or something else entirely, is a conversation worth having separately. But in the context of this story, it was a factor. And then came the moment that crystallized everything. In the days leading up to the draft, a report emerged that changed the temperature of the entire conversation. It was reported, and subsequently widely circulated across NFL media, that during at least one pre-draft interview, there had been a significant tension between Shedeur's camp and the interviewing team's staff. The specifics varied depending on the source, but the core claim was that Shedeur had come into an interview in a manner that the team's evaluators had found off-putting. Not hostile, not disrespectful in any overt way, but guarded, stiff, unwilling to be vulnerable, presenting himself as a finished product rather than as a young quarterback eager to learn. And in the NFL, that distinction between a player who presents as eager and coachable versus one who presents as complete and certain is enormous. Teams don't just want talent at quarterback. They want a specific kind of person. They want someone who, despite all the confidence required to play that position, still has the humility to say, "Teach me, coach me. I want to be great and I'm willing to do whatever it takes." The perception that was hardening around Shedeur Sanders was that he wasn't presenting that way. Whether that perception was accurate, whether it was shaped by unconscious biases in the evaluation process, whether it was manufactured by teams with agendas to push his value down, these are all legitimate questions, but perception in the NFL draft is reality. By the time the actual draft arrived, what had seemed like a coronation had become a genuine cliffhanger. Would the Browns take Shedeur at 1? Would they take Cam Ward? Would they move off the pick entirely? Draft rooms across the league were buzzing. NFL Network analysts were hedging. Reporters who had confidently predicted Shedeur at number 1 were now walking back their certainty on air. And what happened at the draft, the actual sequence of events as picks were made, as teams made their selections, as Shedeur's name either was or wasn't called when and where everyone expected, those were the moments that validated every concern, confirmed every rumor, and turned a complicated draft story into a defining moment in the career of one of football's most watched young figures. The draft unfolded in a way that nobody in Shedeur's camp could have scripted. The Browns made their pick, and when they did, it was not Shedeur Sanders. The broadcast cameras found him in the green room, surrounded by family, wearing the composed expression of someone who had prepared for this possibility, but was still feeling the weight of it. His father was nearby. The moment was loaded with meaning, with history, with expectation, with the particular kind of public vulnerability that comes from having your professional fate decided on live television in front of millions of people who have been either rooting for you or against you from the very beginning. Shedeur Sanders eventually heard his name called. He was selected. His NFL career would begin. But the position at which he was taken, the distance between where the projections had him and where he actually landed, was a statement. It was the league speaking. It was every anonymous source and closed-door interview and whispered concern and Todd Monken press conference adding up to a draft result that nobody in the Sanders camp had wanted.
Now the real story begins. Because here's what the football world needs to understand about Shedeur Sanders in the wake of all this. The narrative isn't over. It never is with talent like this. The history of the NFL draft is littered with quarterbacks who fell further than expected, who were doubted and dismissed and forced to prove themselves in environments that didn't always give them the benefit of the doubt, and who came out the other side as champions. Tom Brady is the most famous example, but he's far from the only one. The draft is not destiny, it is a starting point. What Shedeur Sanders does with what happens next, how he responds to the adversity of the pre-draft process, how he enters his NFL franchise, what kind of teammate and professional he proves himself to be, how he performs when the lights are brightest, will determine whether the Todd Monken press conference and the shortened interviews and the anonymous whispers are remembered as prescient warnings or catastrophically wrong misreadings of a future champion. The people who doubted him want to be proven right. The people who believed in him want to be proven right. And Shedeur Sanders, standing at the beginning of his professional career, with every chip on his shoulder that a man in his position would naturally carry, has the opportunity of a lifetime to settle the debate once and for all. The question is not whether he has the talent. Everyone agrees he has talent. The question is whether he has the everything else, the patience, the coachability, the hunger, the willingness to be shaped by a professional environment that will challenge everything he thinks he knows about himself. If the answer to that question is yes, then the people who passed on him will spend years regretting it. If the answer is no, then the NFL will add another chapter to its long history of highly touted prospects who couldn't make the transition. The story of Shedeur Sanders and Todd Monken and the Cleveland Browns and this entire chaotic, emotional, controversial pre-draft cycle is a story that doesn't have an ending yet. It has a beginning. And that beginning, as painful and complicated and publicly scrutinized as it was, might be exactly the fuel that a player of Shedeur Sanders' character needs to write the ending that he has always believed was his destiny. Football has a way of doing that, of taking the moments that feel like defeats and turning them into the origin stories of greatness. The question is never whether you get knocked down. The question is always what you do when you get back up. Watch Shedeur Sanders. Watch closely, because whatever happens next, however his NFL career unfolds, you will want to say you were paying attention from the very beginning. This video is based on publicly available reports, media coverage, draft analysis, and ongoing developments surrounding the NFL pre-draft process and Shedeur Sanders' draft positioning. Some details referenced are drawn from anonymous sourcing as reported by established NFL media outlets. The views expressed represent storytelling and analysis based on available information at the time of production. This content does not represent confirmed insider knowledge and should be understood as commentary and journalism based on public reporting. All subjects referenced are presumed innocent of any wrongdoing, and this story is intended for informational and entertainment purposes only.